Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story. It's hump day. It's the middle of the week. I'm still working on the shout out. Hopefully, I will finish it tomorrow. I won't get much done today because, well, we gotta go grocery shopping today after Joe gets home from work, so we'll see. Hopefully it'll be out by Friday. That's my goal. In the meantime, an individual shout out. Ready? Go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. This shout out is for our friend. Let's see who it is today. Oh, there we go. Ready? Go. You spin me right round, baby, right round, like a record player, round, baby. Makeup, okay. Okay. It's Makeup Mom and Son. I'm a proud mom who loves to do monthly subscription unboxing, mystery box unboxing, so a lot of unboxing. Makeup tutorials, giveaways, lives, and more. So if you like unboxing or makeup, which I don't do, I never got the hang of it, and I was allergic to a lot of it. But I like her channel, she's very interesting. Check her out, like, share, comment, have a good day. Alright, Mr. Bud, what you gonna tell us?
Well, one of the highlights in history, and it was pretty much considered by a number of militaries to be kind of the turning point in the European theater of World War II, was the landings at D-Day. You know, for the mildly uninformed or people completely sleeping, D-Day was the mass landing that took place in Normandy, involving 5 beaches. It involved the American troops, Canadian troops, and British troops scattered along the coastline, and it basically was the kickoff point for invading of Nazi Germany. For the Germans, they controlled pretty much the entire mainland of Europe for a number of years, and they pretty much knew we were going to be coming because, well, they built up fortifications, gun emplacements, all sorts of stuff waiting for us. Us in our diligence also took several steps to counteract this effect. Bombing of bridges, destroying of ammo trains. We even sent in commandos the night before the actual landings occurred to try to locate and occupy key crossroads in the middle of the night. But interestingly enough, some people don't realize that there was several operations that took place before the major landing took place. Some might say that it was a test run. They served their purposes. First one was Operation Torch, and it was basically an Allied invasion of French North Africa during the Second War. Torch was a compromise operation that met the British objective of securing victory in North Africa while allowing American armed forces the opportunity to engage the fight against Nazi Germany on a limited scale. First mass involvement of the U.S. troops in the European North African theater, and they also saw the first major airborne assault carried out by the U.S. Now, that took place in November of 1942, almost 2 years before D-Day would take place, which took place in June, and it turned out to be quite successful. The territory was recaptured from the French Algerian folks, free French control of West Africa was reachieved, and surprisingly enough, a wide spread of forces would go into this effect. You had the United States, the United Kingdom, India, Canada, Netherlands, and Australia for the Allies. France, interestingly enough, had to fight against themselves. You had the Free France, who joined England while France was occupied, and then you had what was known as Vichy France. Vichy France was kind of the pro-Nazi southern part of France that was still supposedly independent, but not really. They also had the French in Algeria, the French in Monaco, or I should say Morocco, and then you had the Germans and the Italians. But in this entire operation, for the commanders and the leaders, you saw several fellows that would go on later for namesakes: Eisenhower, Patton, and for the ground forces, there was a total of 107,000 troops that took part. For the Navy, for the Allies, 350 warships, 500 transports. The Germans and the Axis were supported by 125,000 troops, 210 tanks, 500 aircraft, and of course 4 batteries and artillery pieces. The Nazis also had 1 battleship, which was partially armed, 10 other warships, and 11 submarines that took part. Now, interestingly enough, out of the casualties list, the United States had 526 dead. For the Vichy France, they had over 1,300 die and almost 2,000 wounded. Several of the shore batteries were blown up. All the artillery pieces were captured. 6 submarines lost, 5 destroyers lost, 1 cruiser lost, and 2 flotilla leaders were lost, including 8 submarines, all the way to the 17th of November. Now, as those operations were, going through, it did give the United States a good chance to see what European theater combat was going to be like. Now, the other case that came up, and this happened before Torch happened, and it involved the United Kingdom, Canada, Free French, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. This was an operation at a place called Dieppe, and when Dieppe was going to go through, they had a number of forces coming in from both the Canadians and the British. They even had some American soldiers who took part, the U.S. Army Rangers, and they were attached to Commando 4 and 15 French Commando. But they would wind up making a landing at a location called Dieppe in France, little coastal town. The basic idea that a lot of people were looking at was that this was going to be a test to see exactly how fortified Germany had made the coastline. A lot of the forces that came through, it literally was like straight from southern England right to the coast. The Royal Air Force supplied a lot of fighters. There were some bombers that were put into use, several North American Mustangs, and then, of course, the pilots that were needed to keep those planes flying. Now, overall, the Germans at that time had the 302nd Static Division. It was about 1,500 men, not including the Luftwaffe or the Kriegsmarine. But they would wind up going up against Gerd von Rundstedt, and the British countered with Louis Mountbatten, John Roberts, Trafford Lee Mallory, and John Hughes Hallett. Now, as things would go off, this was also known as Operation Jubilee, Allied amphibious attack, and over 6,050 infantry, predominantly the Canadians, supported by a regiment of tanks, were put ashore from a naval force operating under the protection of RAF fighters. Now, their idea was the port would be captured and held for a short period to test the feasibility of a landing and to gather intelligence. German coastal defenses, port structures, and important buildings were to be demolished. And the raid was intended to boost Allied morale, demonstrate the commitment of the United Kingdom to reopen the Western Front, and support the Soviet Union fighting on the Eastern Front. As it turned out, aerial and naval support was insufficient to enable the ground forces to achieve their objectives. Tanks were basically trapped on the beach, and infantry largely prevented from entering the town due to obstacles in German fire. The operation, sadly, lasted less than 6 hours. Mounting casualties would force a retreat. The operation was a fiasco, in which only one landing force achieved its objective, and some intelligence, including electronic intelligence, was gathered. Well, over the course of 10 hours, 3,623 of the 6,086 men who landed were killed, wounded, or became prisoners of war. The Luftwaffe made a maximum effort against the landing, as the RAF had expected, but the RAF lost 106 aircraft, at least 32 of these to anti-aircraft fire, against only 48 German losses. The Royal Navy lost 33 landing craft and a destroyer in the process. Now, with any battle, they talk about, what did they learn from this particular operation, besides the fact that it went horribly wrong. First of all, the Allies learned lessons that would wind up influencing successive D-Day landings. Artificial harbors were declared crucial. These were a neat little invention called the mulberries. And they worked out pretty good because they were able to take artificial harbors, take them out so many, about a mile out to sea, and sink them. But then the Allies could load up their forces out there and then only make a tiny trip into the mainland. And it saved the effort of having to sail all the way from England all the way to the coastline. Tanks were adapted specifically for beaches. They didn't work very well on the sand. And a new integrated tactical air force was strengthened to help the ground support operations. Capturing a major port at the outset was no longer seen as a priority. One thing that was also discovered as time went along, Germany really liked the idea of fortresses on the coast, so much that in a number of cases, instead of wasting 3 months trying to break a fortress, just marched around them, cut the roads off, and let them basically do like we did in the Pacific. They starved the forts into submission. Churchill and Mountbatten both claimed that these lessons had outweighed the cost. The Germans also believed that Dieppe was a learning experience and made considerable effort to improve the way they defended occupied coastlines of Europe. Shortly after that, a lot of conscripted labor were later seen building anti-aircraft positions, coastal battery guns, lots and lots of embedded concrete with rebar so that they could withstand coastal shelling from ships. There was a lot of things that they wanted to do specifically for that purpose. Now, part of the deal that the British wanted to go ahead and use this as kind of a flag on what their efforts were going to look like. After Dunkirk was evacuated by the British Expeditionary Force in May of 1940, the British started this development of substantial raiding force under the umbrella of the Combined Operations Headquarters. Now, this was accompanied by the development of techniques and equipment for amphibious warfare. There were a lot of unique little projects that went to play, both the U.S. and the British. At this time, the U.S. was still technically out until Pearl Harbor happened. But one of the schemes the British had was landing 12 divisions around Le Havre, assuming the withdrawal of German troops to counter Soviet success to the east. From this came Operation Rudder, to test the feasibility of capturing a port by an opposed landing. The investigation of the problems operating said invasion fleet and testing equipment and techniques for the assault. After its victory in the Battle of Britain and the Luftwaffe having to switch to night bombing in the fall of 1940, day fighters were a force without any immediate mission. So, they would sit out in the airfields waiting for an assignment, strafing boats, escorting bombers. In the spring of 1941, they were deployed on a series of search and destroy missions flying over France to engage the Luftwaffe in combat. In the second half of 1941, the aerial offensive over France was greatly stepped up, leading to the loss of 411 British and Canadian aircraft. And in the spring of 1942, the Luftwaffe deployed the new Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighter to its airfields. Now, this is superior to the Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane used by the British and Canadian pilots, and saw increase in losses. Now, the RAF was convinced it was winning the air war, and believing the loss of 259 Spitfires over France in the first 6 months were justified by the reported destruction of 197 German aircraft in the same period. Their basic theory was that, we're going to win a war by attrition. The major problem for the RAF was that the Luftwaffe German fighter pilots declined to engage in combat over the French coast and instead operated inland, forcing the British Spitfires to fly deeper into France, using up their fuel and placing them at a disadvantage when the Luftwaffe would engage, and, critically, if the RAF pilots had to bail out, they would be in enemy-occupied territory. But the major idea also that came with Dieppe was they knew the Germans had what was called Ultra. Ultra basically was an ability that the British knew if the Allied force attempted to seize a port in France, the Germans would assume that this was the beginning of an invasion, thus the Luftwaffe would mount a maximum effort. The Fighter Command lobbied in 1942 for a raid to seize the French port and provoke the Luftwaffe into action with the RAF at an advantage. Now, Dieppe itself, small coastal town, built along a long cliff that overlooks the English Channel. There's a river nearby, western end of the town, and the Arquus flows through the town, and has a medium-sized harbor. Well, in 1942, the Germans had demolished some seafront buildings and an aid in coastal defense and set up 2 large artillery batteries. One important consideration was the planners was that Dieppe was within range of the RAF fighter aircraft. Now, also, about the same time, there was intense pressure from the Soviet Union to open up a second front in the Western Europe. By early 1942, the Workspace Operation Barbarossa had clearly failed to destroy the Soviet Union. However, the Germans had a much less ambitious summer offensive launched in June and were deep into Soviet territory, pushing towards Stalingrad. Stalin himself had repeatedly demanded the Allies create a second front in France to force the Germans to move at least 40 divisions away from the Eastern Front and to remove some of the pressure put on the Red Army by the Soviet Union. Now, the proposed Allied invasion of continental Europe in 1943, Operation Roundup, was considered impractical by military planners, and the alternative landing in 1942, Sledgehammer, even more difficult. The British had been engaged with the Italians and Germans in the Western Desert campaign since 1940. At the Second Washington Conference, the U.S. President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill decided to postpone the cross-English Channel invasion and scheduled Torch. Now, for later that year, in the interim, a large-scale Canadian-led raid on the French coast was intended to take some of the pressure off the Soviet Union. Now, on the directive of Winston Churchill, Louis Mountbatten was recalled from his captaincy on the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious while it was under repair in the U.S. in 1941, and he was instated as an advisor on combined operations of the British Army, replacing Admiral Roger Keyes, who as director of combined operations, had fallen out with the chiefs of staff and Churchill. Later be promoted to the post of chief of combined operations, Churchill personally briefed Mountbatten what he wanted the raids as of increasing intensity, developing equipment, and training with a view to the invasion of France. The chiefs of staff limited Mountbatten's authority to approve only small raids using special service troops. He held a dual role as advisor to the chiefs of staff and the Commodore of Combined Operations. In 1942, Mountbatten was raised by Churchill as a full member of the meetings of the chiefs of staff with acting rank of vice admiral, air marshal, and lieutenant general. And in May of 1942, it was agreed that the Combined Operations HQ would handle detailed planning of the Dieppe raid. Now, the Co-HQ proposed flanking landings that would take a Dieppe in a pincer movement. Home forces argued that for a frontal attack, as within the 15-hour window of the raid, the flank attacks would not have enough time to achieve success. At meetings, Mountbatten argued that it was sufficient for the raid to show that the tactics would have worked. Montgomery countered that the raid did not take Dieppe, it would be seen as a failure. Initial heavy bombardment from the air was approved, despite concerns of civilian casualties, then rescinded due to Army opinion that the wreckage would block streets for the tanks, and the RAF belief that most of the bombs would end up in the sea or inland. Mountbatten pressed for the firepower of a battleship for bombardment in lieu to the bombing, but neither this nor cruisers was permitted. Equally, combined operations proposed the assault force of Marines and commandos was passed over in favor of untried Canadian troops. So, based on what they've got here going, the biggest problem the British had was that there was a lot of arguments on how they were going to run this operation. One side needed and wanted additional firepower to try to soften up the landing areas, and the other side simply wanted to go with some light air power and smaller numbers of troops. Mountbatten was well known for his chivalry and charming abilities, however he lacked experience in terms of actual warfare. Even before taking up his role, Mountbatten faced a tough patch at sea, captaining the HMS Kelly as commander of the 5th Destroyer Flotilla, where his performance was so far below par that Dennis Healy, who was the Secretary of State for Defense when Mountbatten was the Chief of Defense Staff in the 1960s, remarked, "But his birth saved him from the court-martial that any other officer would have faced." But despite the shortcomings, Mountbatten played an important role in the planning of the whole operation. The Dieppe was intended as an experiment and initially planned to take place at the end of June 1942. Preparations were full swing with 2 rehearsals taking place in Bridgeport on the 13th and 23rd of June. The second, due to the debacle, was the first turned into. However, bad weather delayed the operation by 3 weeks, and 2 vessels that were to be used put out of action by bombs. This made the chiefs of staff uneasy, thinking that the Germans would have found out about the attack by then, as the plan was no longer a secret to more than 10,000 Allied troops who had been informed of it. And on the 8th of July, General Bernard Montgomery recommended calling off the attack altogether. This probably would have been one of Montgomery's smartest ideas.
What?
But they decided, 6 weeks later, they were still aiming at Dieppe. His arguments that although the enemy must have found out that Dieppe was the original target, the very last thing the Germans ever imagined is that we'd be so stupid to lay on the same operation again.
That shows what they know.
Yeah. But as the operation would take place, go through some of the aftermath and details, the Germans, the capture of a copy of the Dieppe plan allowed the Germans to analyze the operation. Rundstedt criticized the plan rigidly, saying, "This plan is in German terms not a plan, it is more of a position paper or the intended course of an exercise." Other German officers were equally unimpressed. Conrad Haas considered it incomprehensible that a division was expected to overrun a German regiment that was supported by artillery. General Adolf Friedrich Kunzen could not understand why the Porteville landings were not reinforced with tanks when they might have succeeded in leaving the beach. The Germans were unimpressed by Churchill tanks left behind. The armament and armor was compared and favorable with what the Germans and Soviet tanks had used. The Luftwaffe was pleased on how well they had performed during the air battle. One report judged that the Focke-Wulf 190, which formed the bulk of the air defense, to be in every way suitable as a fighter bomber, and it ascribes the good performance, despite its marked numerical superiority, to the aggressiveness and better training of German fighter pilots. The Luftwaffe had been so active during the battle that only 70 of the 230 airframes available at the start of the day were combat ready by the day's end. The Luftwaffe had consumed all of its 20mm cannon ammunition available in the West, so much so that there was not enough for routine flight operations for the next couple days. Now, while the Germans were pleased with their successful defense, while noting faults in their own communication, transport, and locational support forces, but recognized that the Allies were certain to learn some lessons from the operation and set out improving their fixed defenses. As the overall theater commander in the West, Rundstedt was adamant the Germans must learn Diepp's lessons. He was anxious the Germans were not left behind learning from Dieppe. Just as we have gained the valuable experience from the day of Dieppe, the enemy has learned it well. Just as we evaluate experience for the future, so will the enemy. Perhaps he will do this to gain even greater extent because he paid so dearly for it. Now, for the Allies, Dieppe became a textbook of what not to do in amphibious landings and laid the framework for the Normandy landings. Dieppe showed the need for preliminary artillery support, including aerial bombardment, surprise. Now, surprise is the funny one, because when D-Day happened, Patton played a very key role in this. When D-Day was getting ready to go into action, there was a huge army located by Dover, and Patton was the commanding officer of it. The entire army basically was inflatable, but it was so visible, it had the Germans scared. And so that's why a lot of the forces that could have stopped Normandy's invasion were held north and out of position. And it turned into a critical factor. Proper intelligence concerning enemy fortifications, again, knowing what forces they're going to be facing when they go in for landings. Avoidance of a frontal attack on a defended port. That's why, when we chose the beaches that they did, they wanted to go after the ones that would give them the best chance to get in, penetrate the beaches as far as they could, and also the last step here, proper re-embarkment craft. A lot of our landing crafts, we had tanks that had skiffs basically set up so that they could actually get into the shores and up onto the beaches. Breaking through beach and coastal defenses was key. Now, interestingly enough, while the Canadian contingent fought boldly in the face of a determined enemy, it was ultimately circumstances outside of their control which sealed their fate. Despite criticism concerning the inexperience of the Canadian brigades, scholars have noted that even seasoned professionals would have been hard-pressed under the deplorable conditions brought by their superiors. The commanders who planned the raid on Dieppe had not envisioned such losses. This was one of the first attempts by the Western Allies on a German-held port city. As a consequence, planning from the highest ranks of the preparation for the raid was minimal. Basic strategy and tactic errors were made and resulted with a higher than expected Allied, particularly Canadian, death rate. Also, to help future landings, the British would develop specialist armored vehicles for engineers to perform tasks protected by armor. Because the tracks of most of the Churchill tanks were caught up in the shingle beach, the Allies began to study beach geology where they intended to land and adapting vehicles for them. Allies changed their view that capturing a major port was necessary to establish a second front. The damage inflicted on the port to capture it by the Germans firing demolition charges would make it useless afterwards. The Mulberry harbors were to be built and towed to the beaches during the invasion. Now, while the RAF was generally able to keep the German aircraft from the
land battle, and the ships operating demonstrated the need for air superiority as well as showing major deficiencies in the RAF ground support techniques. This led to the creation of the Integrated Tactical Air Force for Army support. But as it was, 2 years later, when D-Day went into play, a lot of different factors would prove to become critical. First of all, the numbers and forces that took place in D-Day was just astronomical. I think the biggest thing that also helped the Allies during D-Day was the fact is it was pretty much a complete surprise. I mean, even when they had the few commandos that parachuted in the night before to take care of key things, a lot of the bombing that was going on, the Germans didn't think anything of it. One of our trains got blown up. Yeah, that happens. A bridge got bombed. Yeah, that happens too. The Allies didn't make any specific creative approaches on, being selective, saying, well, let's not hit this bridge. We might need it in a couple weeks. No, they pretty much the idea was, well, if we blow up this bridge, the Germans can't bring tanks down it. So, but it was a couple small steps that led up to D-Day, and it turned out to be very critical. But this has been Joe, the bearded historian, with Sue manning the camera, and she's tired. We'll see you guys later on. Have a good night.